Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event. Hopefully, you are tuning into the right thing, and hopefully, you can see the right person on your screen right now. I'm Dr. Simon Kay. I'm the Director of Policy at the think tank Reform, and I'm also the project leader on our brand new Reimagining the Local State program. This is our big foray into policy surrounding devolution, communities, and the future of the local government sector. And it's hugely exciting to be bringing what I hope will be the first of a long series of fascinating and interesting events, and that we're going to be running primarily online because, surprise, surprise, we can't concentrate all of our attention here in the Westminster bubble where the Reform think tank is based. We need to be able to do it in a format where we can talk to interesting people from around the country and get participants from around the country as well. Today's event, Beyond the Ballot, the state of local government, is exactly what it sounds like. It's our attempt to understand the implications of the recent local elections, the impact that they might have on the sector, a sector going through a massive transitional moment and experiencing in many areas something of a financial crisis as well. For the first time in these recent local elections, we saw regional mayors at a greater scale than ever before being directly elected at the scale of combined authorities, as well as in the GLA in London. We saw police and crime commissioners up and down the country getting directly elected as well. And of course, there were councillors across many dozens of councils across England as well. So helping me to understand all of those things, we're joined by a fantastic expert panel. We've got Keiran Pedley joining us from Ipsos, Director of Politics at Ipsos. Laura Shoaf is, of course, the Chief Executive of the West Midlands Combined Authority. No major news stories playing out in your neck of the woods right now, Laura, right? No, maybe a few. And last but not least, we've got Heather Jameson, who is the editor of what I consider to be the best and most important of the local government sector news outlets, the weekly Municipal Journal. Or Heather, should we call it the MJ? What's the preference there? Do we prefer the
Well,
MJ?
it's the MJ, but for the uninitiated, Municipal Journal makes more sense because the MJ is reasonably meaningless if you don't know what we cover.
Right. Well, look, I'll do my best to stick to that. But maybe I like to say the whole thing. It makes it sound super important. Just a few very quick notes here. If you are joining us live today, we'd love to hear your questions, and I will carefully sprinkle them into the discussion that will emerge over the course of our hour together. To do that, we're not going to be observing or monitoring the chat function in the Zoom webinar system here. Instead, it'll be the Q&A one. So you'll find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and you'll have an opportunity to add your question. Please do that at any time during proceedings. Don't hold your question. And me and my team will keep an eye on those and try to work in as many of those questions as we can as we go along. Now, that's it really in terms of housekeeping. There's almost too many different things for us to jump into in terms of themes and ideas here today. My instinct is to start, I think, with you, Heather. What for you would be the main lesson, the main takeaway from what we've observed in these recent local elections?
So I think a few things here. I mean, this set of elections has been scrutinised like no other. So there's very little left unsaid that I can probably add to the debate. But let me have a pop at it anyway. I think what was interesting is as a sector, local government tends to get quite grumpy about the fact that we're always sort of relegated to being an extended opinion poll about the national politics. And I think more than ever, this one was exactly that. As we know, we're in the run up to a general election. So I think there's been a massive use of local government elections for that. But I think there's some interesting things happening, and I think Laura will hopefully forgive me for stepping on her toes here. But I think particularly in the West Midlands mayor, there was an awful lot of talk about it being a sort of more about Gaza than it was about the national politics. And I've heard Jess Phillips say quite a lot that she didn't hear anyone talking about Birmingham on the doorstep. And I think that's a really interesting dimension that geopolitics is featuring in local elections and local politics less so. I think it was particularly an election where the strength and power of mayors and the recognisability of mayors has been really visible. And then I think overall, you know, it was a bad night for the Conservatives. It was interesting that there's roughly the same number of councils in no overall control as beforehand. So there's quite a lot came out of no overall control and quite a few went in. And then the other one that I'm going to point out, just as a fun aside, was Castle Point. So interestingly, in Surrey, there's now no council in district council in Surrey that is overall Conservative, which is an extraordinary thing for the Conservatives. But in Castle Point, there's no Conservatives councillors, no Labour councillors, no Lib Dem councillors, and not even a Green. It is all independents.
That is fascinating, and the rise of the independent candidate at that local scale is perhaps a kind of a meta narrative that we should be trying to think our way through, because it's something that we sometimes see towards the end of a parliament at the national scale. We see that rise of sort of less affiliated MPs, people who've been either kicked out or left their parties, and so we get seats, constituency Westminster seats around the country that are represented by MPs with no proper affiliation to a party. But this is more deliberate than that. This is a locality deliberately selecting independent candidates. I think that's fascinating. Do you think it tells us anything more broadly, Heather?
Yeah, well, and again, this is probably more Keiran's bag than mine, but I think it's interesting that people are I would say post Brexit, post the referendum, people have been gradually turning off the main political parties and more interested in non-political issues. I mean, I think it's really easy to forget when you are in our position and you are rather obsessive about politics. It's easy to forget that members of the public generally are not as interested as we are, and so it's all about one or two different policies locally that will get the cut through. If you try and talk too much about some of the things that I rather geekily find fascinating about local government, about offlog, about the economic growth in local government, all that kind of thing. It's not generally what people want. They want to see what difference this is going to make to their lives, and I don't think they really often comprehend how much difference local government actually makes to their lives.
No, I think that's a hugely important point, and one that people, as you say, are disconnected from. My rule of thumb, if anyone's interested, is usually just to assume that you are always going to be the biggest weirdo in any conversation about policy, politics, or local government. And I'm not saying the active you for you, Heather, but
Oh no, I'll
personally,
take
I've
that.
it's true though. People are fairly disinterested, or rationally even disinterested in some of the minutiae about these points, and that feeds through into an awful lot of what plays out in an election and plays out in policy terms for the sector. Thank you so much, Heather. Laura, turning to you, if I may, what would you say is your biggest takeaway? Obviously, you're in the midst, in the thick of one of the most complex uh, political and policy situations in the entire country. Everyone was glued to their screens watching what played out with the directly elected mayor of the West Mids. And you are on the front line of responding to that situation and
Yeah.
making sure the institution can navigate it.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with Heather's point, because it sometimes is a little bit frustrating that it's like the interest is sort of a bellwether for what is going to happen nationally. But there's no doubt for the West Midlands that the coverage that we got of our elections raised the profile of mayors and raised the profile of devolution. And so for that, I think it's a really good thing that it was, you know, headlining on the news, and a close election that was of interest. I was just sort of thinking before I get on to sort of what it brings, but I was thinking about what you were just saying about that sort of interest in local elections at the door, and obviously being American. I lived in California for many years, you know, and there you're literally voting on your local tax policy. You might be voting on local education policy when you're voting locally. So it feels much in some weird way. I wonder, because it feels so connected, back into representation, I think, whereas we're still really quite a centralized country with decisions on a lot of stuff that really matters still being taken at the center. So I was just reflecting on that while you were talking about that. But it can only be a good thing that the national media was in the West Midlands having a look at accountability and democracy, at a regional level. I think it could have was a knife edge. It could have gone either way, and that was definitely the feeling at the count. Nobody knew sort of how it would go, but we are in the midst of. We did a lot of preparation because we knew it was going to be a hugely close election, so we prepared for both outcomes, which is exactly what you need to do in that situation. We really had some good sort of access talks, and we made a lot of information available to all the candidates in the lead up to it to try to help make sure that manifestos were shaped by sort of things we can do locally. And if what you read in the papers is right, and we are likely to have a general election, and a Labour government is more likely, and again probably more Keiran's bag than mine, but then the West Midlands will have achieved a sort of unique thing, which was for a long time having a Conservative mayor with a Conservative government, then to move to having a Labour mayor with a potential Labour government. I think the other thing I would say is that, it's really interesting to both the candidates' manifestos, which are obviously available online, had policies in them and areas of influence where they want to bring the sort of wider ecosystem together about things that aren't necessarily mayoral powers to date. So I think that there's a real ambition from all the mayors to start to talk a little bit more about public service reform and maybe about, sort of where next for the sort of wider project of devolution. But it felt that this election was sort of definitely a turning point, both in terms of sort of recognition of its importance, about the attention that has been paid to it, and about how important it is for places and that role of mayor. This is the third election we've had. I think there have been 57 MP election. So, it has to build. These things have to build up in time. But, if you told me in 2016, when we started the journey, that, that we would have, Sky and the BBC's national teams reporting from the West Midlands mayoral election, I'm not sure I would have believed you, to be honest. So it does sort of mark a real progression for what mayors want to do and want to achieve. Can I make one other sort of comment, which I thought was really interesting? The other thing that I feel quite proud of, actually, although it had absolutely nothing to do with me, but there's been quite a lot of reflection in the media about the speeches at our count. So both that the departing mayor was incredibly gracious, as was the incoming mayor, paying real tribute to legacy in one case and opportunity in the other, and that has just genuinely, not just in the building where we are, but in the region, has felt really good. There's been quite a lot of national discussion about that, and people really reacting to that. People really actually hungry for sort of that level of sort of step up into political debate. And that again was sort of covered really well by all sorts of national media outlets in terms of the way that our candidates handled themselves. And I think there's a lesson in there somewhere as well.
That's such an interesting point that it's changed what I want to follow up on with you, Laura, which is that, and Heather and Keiran might have a different view on this, but local politics isn't usually renowned for its sort of statesman-like behavior, or the kind of the idea that it's depolarized compared to the national picture. Do you think there's something special about the political balance in the West Midlands that causes a slightly different tone to emerge during campaigning? Because it's one of the things that distinguishes the West Midlands from some of the other big regional political centres like Greater Manchester is that it's politically a bit more fractured, that there's a little bit more diversity across the piece?
So on our board, and we still have some AGMs to go through locally to know where we're going to wind up, but not for every year of the past 7 years, but definitely for the majority, we have had a totally balanced board, 4 and 4. So to make any decisions, to take forward decisions at all, requires consensus, and that requires, working in a different way. And the region is quite good in that way. It's quite mature in that way of working because it's had to be. But I do think there's something about the role specifically, and we saw this playing out in other areas. It felt very personal. Mayoral campaigns felt very personal, and the pride mayors have in their places and the pride in the role, I think, sets it aside a little bit more. So, as emotional and as difficult as it is to win and not to win, I think that decorum comes from a deep sense of sort of pride of service, which I can't speak for other areas, but we definitely have here in the West Midlands.
Thank you so much, Laura. That's so interesting, and I'm sure we'll come back around to some of these points and go further with them. Keiran, coming to you, certainly not least, though last. Both Heather and Laura have sort of pitched additional questions your way already. I don't know if you've been keeping track of those, but I'd be fascinated to hear what your big take-homes are from this most recent local election.
Yes. So first of all, thank you for having me today. It's great to be having these discussions now that the dust has settled to some degree, insofar as it can this year. I guess I'd split my takeaways into 2 parts, right? One is about what the results tell us, in themselves, about politics in the UK in an election year. But I think then beyond that, obviously, what we're here today to talk about is about kind of what it all means for local government and things moving forward. I think on the election results themselves, there's probably 2 things. The projected national vote share obviously created a great intense discussion about what that meant for the future in any hypothetical general election. But I think the big picture there is that there was, obviously a very bad night for the Conservatives, and that in reality, if the Reform Party, if Reform UK had stood everywhere, the likelihood is that that gap would have been larger, and actually any discussion of hung parliament would almost be moot. Not that it's moot forever, but just in terms of right now, we have to wait and see what happens in the run up to the election. But what stood out to me was the mayors, to be honest, and the fact that their voters clearly were behaving differently in London and West Midlands and elsewhere than they might have otherwise done in a sort of so-called generic ballot. The personality of mayors does matter, and I think this says something hopefully positive for the future about accountability in local government. Not that it wasn't there before, but just in terms of how the public perceive that. Because clearly, whilst you can criticize personality-based politics and so on, having that figurehead that clearly has influenced how people have voted is important. So I'm sort of fascinated by that moving forward. But on the future of local government itself, I think it's hard to disentangle these results sometimes, because we know that people vote for a myriad of reasons in local elections. When we were polling people in England before them, we found a mixture of local and national issues coming up as why people would vote the way they did. The condition of the streets and roads and potholes is always in the top 2, but then the NHS, the state of the NHS and cost of living are in the sort of top 2 or 3 as well. So disentangling all of that together is difficult. People are complicated. They wear many hats when they go to the polls. So that's obviously tricky. But I think when we look at perceptions of local government and services at the moment, there are very obvious challenges that local government faces moving forward that won't be news to a lot of people, primarily to do, delivering ever increasing statutory demands with less and less money, to put it mildly, in an environment where 78% of the public tell us they think public services have got worse in the last 5 years. That number's less when you ask people about their local services, around half, but still very much a negative trajectory, a negative direction of travel. And I think the specific challenge for local government there is when you ask people about what sort of actors are important in terms of what drives your local services, yes, but also there's the quality of life in your local area. Local councils will come top, above central government, above other factors. But then when you ask people how much they know about how decisions are made locally, 2/3 say they know not very much. or not at all. So there's a knowledge gap there, which obviously makes local government and local councils and local authorities a very easy target for those that want to seek to shift blame in that direction, because local residents, by and large, aren't that familiar with how decisions are made. And again, without going full circle, maybe with Metro mayors and other sort of arrangements, that can be part of the solution there. Levelling up remains a big issue, and I think that we see this when we ask around the country, do you think that the government spends less in your area than it does on others? That the further away you get from London and the southeast, the higher that sentiment is. So again, the challenges facing local governments and the concerns people have are not the same everywhere. But I think what's maybe encouraged, try and finish on a positive, what is encouraging is that there is an appetite for devolution. 6 in 10 tell us that they support local authorities having more powers to make decisions on funding of public services and the delivery of public services and public transport rather than central government. But obviously the challenges are many in how that's actually executed and what that funding looks like. So there are lots of obvious challenges, but very difficult challenges local government faces, doing more with less, how to innovate, how to have place-based policy, all these things that have to be more than buzzwords, I guess, as whoever wins the next election, it looks like it will be a Labour government, but let's see. There isn't going to be a magic wand that's able to be waved to fix some of these challenges. So I think it's those two parts really. There's the political of Westminster, which does obviously matter because that's where macro policy is generated. But then there is clearly this appetite for devolution executed well, and so it's going to be very interesting to watch the manifestos later this year and what sort of solutions are proposed there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Keiran. As you said, we're all sort of broadly expecting a Labour victory at the next general election. And the signal has gone out in recent weeks that Labour is going to explicitly move on from the language, the framing of levelling up. Well, they'll still want to work on the agenda as so many have in the past. What's a pollster's eye view on that decision? Levelling up seems to me, from the conversations that I have and what I'm aware of, to be an extremely powerful, in electoral terms, in terms of public appeal concept, one that essentially gave a whopping majority to a political party a few years ago. There's been plenty of debate, very, very legitimate debate, about how successfully that levelling up policy platform is being implemented. But it's interesting to see that concept, the conceptualization, the framing of levelling up might be being left behind.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, I'm somewhat surprised by that. I think there is absolutely an appetite, a very strong appetite around the country for levelling up. And clearly you can rebrand it and you can name it different things. And I guess we're going to have to see what the Labour Party's proposals are coming out of their manifesto. Maybe there'll be a very clear hook for it. But I think there's a political risk for Labour in looking like you're jettisoning Labour levelling up without replacing it with anything. I think it feels to me as a pollster that there's a very obvious political dividend to be achieved by saying we will do levelling up, but we'll just make it work. And you've been let down by the Conservatives, and we will make this policy work. Because when we've polled the public over the last Parliament on all the different topics, but NHS, cost of living, crime, and so on and so forth, one of the areas we have done asked about is which party do you trust most on reducing regional inequalities, e.g. levelling up. Labour's had overwhelming leads on this principle. I think there is an inherent brand assumption with the Labour Party, if I can use that language, that they are going to be better at doing that. That might be partly to do with where Labour has traditionally drawn its support from. So I suspect, without knowing, that this is something of a branding exercise, that the principle is there and that there'll be a different mechanism or a different language used to describe it. But there's political risk in that, I think, because it's definitely fertile ground for the party and they don't want to be seen to give it up.
It's really helpful. Thank you, Keiran. It's a fascinating decision that might reveal much in the election to come. And of course, we're all watching out for those manifestos and what they'll reveal about devolution, levelling up, and the rest of this policy space too. Some of the Q&A questions that are coming in build on the idea that, and I think, Heather, if I could turn to you on this one, that there's a kind of a puzzle at the heart of these election results, and it's to do with the extent of the impact of, well, I was about to call it a nascent or an emerging financial crisis across the sector. But actually, this is a crisis that in some ways has been going on for many years, is reaching a head in some places. One question that came in just now on the Q&A facility. Please do use that if you're watching us live. Why did voters seem to punish failing councils in places like Thurrock, Slough, Woking, but not in other places like Sandwell and Liverpool?
Yeah, I would come back to something that Laura was saying earlier on this one, actually. I think there's a lot of this is to do with what I'd refer to as the psychology of place. You have places have their own personalities, and I don't know very much about Sandwell. I've visited. I've never lived there, never spent much time there, but I do know that Liverpool is has a very specific personality, and their reaction to government intervention was very much on the side of the council. It wasn't on the side of the government. It wasn't on the side of the incoming commissioners. It was very much protectionist about their council. I think politics has a lot to play for this. I can't ever imagine. Can you imagine Liverpool ever turning Conservative? It doesn't feel likely. I think there is something about different places and the difficulty again with seeing all the local elections as a reaction to what's happening in national politics is it's all about what happens locally. It's all about how people feel about their local area. And I think that utterly shows true for that. And can I just add a little bit about the levelling up thing? Because I think it was really interesting you got to that. But I think levelling up was a fantastic example of someone taking what has been decades worth of regional economic growth policy, RDAs, the John Prescott and Michael Heseltine, attempting to boost economic performance across the country. And it was verbalized in a way that actually the public who is not geeky about these things understood it. And I think that is, that was the beauty of it. You've now got to a stage where the Conservatives instead just started putting parcels of money into towns funds and things like that, instead of actually properly doing economic growth on a regional level. And I'm hoping that some of the devolution that comes from mayors will be the answer to that, and will be the answer to levelling up in different ways.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Heather. Laura, if I can bring you in at this point, obviously the financial crisis is something that's quite close to the bone in some parts of the West Midlands. Birmingham City Council had to issue its Section 114. It's an area with some of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole country, as well as some of the most affluent spots as well. So there's an enormous amount of diversity there. Speaking from the point of view of someone in a combined authority, do you have the tools that you need to help combat and to address financial difficulty in the sector?
I don't think they are our tools, unfortunately. But what I would say is that, we are a combined authority, right? So I'll pick on transport as a really good example, right? We are the transport authority here at the regional agency, but the council is the highways authority. So in no way, shape, or form do combined authorities succeed as well as they could without really successful, well-funded local authorities. Because, we might decide we want to put a cycleway down a road, but if the highways authority doesn't have the capacity or the capability to help that happen, then it won't happen. So there is a real dependency, and a commonality. And we put in our spring submission something really specific about local government funding and financing. And I think as a combined authority, we will continue to lobby for it because it makes it really, it makes a difference in a place. But it's a very complicated issue. And it's not one that, business rates reform, or there's so many different aspects and angles to it. But we need those services at a community level. So one of the things that the combined authority we try to say is like, if it's not at the scale of a regional level, and if it's not something that requires sort of regional convening, it should be best done closest to the people. So, I think one of the challenges is how we get some of the communities supported and how we deal with some of that. It's difficult for any authority. Sandwell's just coming out. They've done a great job getting out of measures, and Liverpool as well. But it's a pretty brutal process, and we need all aspects of local and regional government to be strong and capable in order to really deliver for people.
It's really helpful. Keiran, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I was just raised my hand there. I wasn't sure if that's the best way to do it, but I think just on the funding point, there is a specific point I want to make about tax, which I think is important, because I think we all accept, obviously, local government has incredible funding challenges. I think is a polite way of putting it, right, in terms of what we've seen across the country. But when we're talking about public opinion on some of this, that has to be weighed along. The desire for more money for local services has to be measured against the cost of living crisis. And we find in public opinion, whether it's in focus groups or opinion polls, that being a constant tension that the public have. So when you ask about the principle of tax rises to fund public services, for example, the public are pretty split on that. So there is some support for that, particularly when it comes to the public services they care about the most. But there is also this tension around individual households' cost of living as well. And specifically on council tax, when we look at the 13 biggest revenue generators in terms of tax in the country. So this is including everything from council tax, yes, to various levels of income tax and VAT and so on and so forth. Council tax is one that's considered to be the least fair, or the most unfair, I should say, alongside fuel duty and inheritance tax, and is actually second on the list of priorities the public would have for cuts. Now, I know the world is bigger when it comes to local government funding. The world is bigger than just council tax. I do completely appreciate that. I think that is a tension at the heart when we're talking about the finite resources and some of those challenges, almost getting to the nub of the issue. That is a real problem that I think local authorities are going to have moving forward, because whilst there is scope to increase council tax, and obviously caps on that have been relaxed, it is very unpopular, and residents will feel that, and they won't necessarily know who is to blame for that. And it goes back to my knowledge point, the knowledge gap point I made earlier. So I think that some of that, when we're thinking about solutions and to some of these financial problems, it isn't easy, and I know we know that.
And this seems like a really apposite moment, Keiran, to pivot from the knowledge gap, and I'm sure there's a relationship here, to, well, we talk an awful lot when we talk about policy in this sector about a democratic deficit, don't we? We talk about low turnouts at local elections. These most recent set of elections, we saw pretty low turnout. In fact, it was backwards. The kind of if the overarching case for regional scale politics is that we get more identifiable politicians, a sense of efficacy from voters, people engaging more visibly and actively, a bit more like they do at a general election, that's not transpiring yet. In fact, in a lot of places, it seems that we're getting less turnout than we did last time. What's your sort of eagle-eye view on the turnout picture for local and regional votes?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it's that I'm going to butcher the phrase, but there is this term about a rising tide raises all boats or something like that. I think I've got that roughly right, but the reverse is true as well. So right now we've got, UK public opinion is generally very, very pessimistic about the state of the country. 76% told us last summer they think it's becoming worse as a place to live. I think back in the late 90s, 40% said that. And trust in politicians we found in the last year or so is the lowest it's ever been. So there is this local versus national tension. And I get that. And of course, I think to some extent, general elections are always going to have higher turnout, because there is just this feeling with the public that, that you can understand how choosing the central government, your prime minister and so on, just feels inherently more important, even if you recognise the importance of local government. So there's always going to be that tension. But I think that some of the turnouts we saw recently are a symptom of that wider malaise, that distrust in politics generally, not a lot of confidence in, either the Conservatives or Labour. What I would say, you shouldn't put them both in the same boat quite that way. There is very much a sense of 7 in 10 saying it's time for change nationally. The Conservatives are extremely unpopular, but there isn't this enthusiasm for Labour either. So all of that, I think, is feeding in. I don't think there is a sort of silver bullet that fixes that overnight, but I do think the fact that people were voting differently, let's say, when it comes to Andy Street, Sadiq Khan, Ben Houchen, or whoever, compared to what they might be doing for local elections, is part of the long-term solution. I think you have to build up those personalities, but ultimately it's about delivery and about a general sense of things improving in the country.
So we need to see some sense of impact. In other words, we need to see things improving for people to feel that they'll get engaged in politics and feel that their vote matters, and that has that virtuous cycle of encouraging people to
Yeah,
come out.
I just think I'm talking a lot here, but I just think that inherently it's just going to be very, very difficult for people to have a positive view of their local area and a really negative view of the country at the same time. Of course, there is always a difference, and it's always common for people to say the NHS is terrible nationally, but actually I quite like my local hospital. You do get that sentiment, but I think that the scale of that difference at the moment is probably too big a bridge to gap.
It's fascinating. And Heather, I think I mean, I got in a little bit of trouble immediately after the elections, and I did some tweeting, and I said, look, I just think there's going to be a ceiling on our ambitions for devolution and for the reform and empowerment of local authorities, unless and until this democratic deficit point gets addressed. But it's a bit of a catch-22, as Keiran just explained to us. What's your view?
Well, interestingly, so I think Keiran mentioned he was going to butcher a quote there. I think I'm going to butcher. I realise we've got Barry Quirk on as one of our viewers, and I'm going to butcher something that he always says, which is, I think he talks about the election of the mayor of Lewisham when he was there, and he mentions quite a lot that the turnout is, I don't know, maybe about 25% in local elections. I don't know what it was for that particular election, although he knows the stats off the top of his head. And if there is 50% of the public voting for the mayor on a 25% turnout or lower, or a 20% turnout or lower, that, what sort of a democratic mandate do you have? And often local politicians talk about their mandate quite a lot. But when it's close on a low turnout, you've not got a marvelously big mandate. And I think all politicians should remember that, shouldn't they? They should remember that they are representing people, but that doesn't give them carte blanche to do exactly what they want and to ride roughshod over everybody else. I think it's a really interesting thing that if we're moving towards lower turnouts. I personally think politicians should be mindful of that and more willing to work in partnership and in cooperation with others than they perhaps might be if they've got a stonking 1997 style majority.
No, thank you, Heather. Point well made, I think. Laura, I think this takes us back to something you said about the relatively constructive atmosphere that seemed to surround the key mayoral candidates in the West Midlands. West Midlands saw turnout decrease slightly. If there's an efficacy connection, as a political scientist might put it, and as Keiran, I think, was indicating there might be as well, does that say something about the additional powers that will be needed at regional scale in order to galvanize greater public interest?
It is a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, really. But there was quite a lot of coverage here too about combating this view that people's vote doesn't matter. I'm going to butcher our stats here, but I think there was roughly 1,500 votes in the difference in the overall count here, and I think there were roughly 1,500 ballot boxes. So that is one more person in every box. And I know there was a lot of busking going on here in the West Midlands because we had a lot of time to fill on the airwaves, but there is definitely something too about changing that narrative about people's role in democracy, why it matters, and just the fact that in regions like ours, your vote really does matter. I wasn't on the doorstep, so I don't claim to have sort of any big insight, but as a person, and not professionally. I sort of understand what Keiran was just saying about, did people vote by not voting with general apathy? What I read and my instinct would just say, yes, probably that is part of it. But equally, until mayors have the sort of, so I grew up in New York City, right? The mayor of New York is responsible for absolutely everything from dog mess and potholes to schools, and to taxes, to everything. So there's a very, like, it's getting that balance right. If until people are really clear about what their roles are, and I don't think it helps that maybe they're not the same up and down the country. The different mayors have different roles and responsibilities in a discussion where we already have a lot of people not really understanding what the role is or who's responsible for what. That's sort of problematic. We need to get to a place where it's quite established. The roles of what people are voting for are well understood. More events where we've got more community engagement. Again, I think it's really important, the sort of democratic engagement between sort of elected officials and the people. They don't happen as much as I think they probably should. Part of our devolution deal, and Manchester's, is also now going to require like an MP question time, again, where there's the more staged and formulaic and regular places for the public and for others to hold people accountable. I think that kind of thing becomes important when we're trying to build that narrative of why the role matters, why people need to get out and vote, and the difference it can make to them.
Laura, it sounds like you for one welcome the some of those accountability sort of structures. There's been a little bit of wailing and gnashing of teeth from some bits of the sector in response to those enhanced accountabilities around the trailblazer deals and the single settlement. But it sounds like you think it's probably a good idea.
I just don't think you can argue that what you are after is greater responsibility without taking on greater accountability. It's just counterintuitive to me. So, I know that previously mayors had said, if they stood ready and willing to be held accountable and responsible, bring them into the Public Accounts Committee, because if we're serious about it, people have to be held accountable.
Yeah, particularly perhaps in a situation where turnout and thereby that kind of democratic accountability is a little weaker than we might prefer it to be. Going to one of the questions now, and I guess I'd be interested to hear from you on this first, Keiran, but please do anyone weigh in on it. We had a question here from Elliot Wilson, saying that, well, one of the distinctive aspects of the West Midlands race, since we're onto it, is that we've got a different profile in a way of politician involved. We had household names duking it out in some parts of the country, whereas everyone who jumped in the West Midlands, especially the key players, entered active politics in order to become mayor. How important would you say those sort of pre-existing political backgrounds and name recognition factors in politics are for a candidate?
So I think name recognition can be very important. It's part of a sort of complex tapestry, really, though, isn't it? Because ultimately, if you look at Andy Street first, when we were polling residents of the West Midlands before the election, not so much on voting intention, but just on perceptions of the job that he's done as mayor, he's very much net positive in terms of favourability, but actually there was still sort of, I think it was around a majority still weren't sure who he was, and then that only increased for Richard Parker and for other sort of alternative candidates. So I think where you've got someone who's high profile and well known, one that jumps out at me, being from living in North London like I do, is probably Boris Johnson back in the day when he was running for London Mayor. When you've got these big hitters running, they are a bit all consuming in terms of the narrative of the race and the contest and how people talk about it in the cafes and the bars and whatever. It's all about that sort of individual personality. But at the same time, you don't want to be that big individual personality like that if it looks like you've been parachuted into a particular area that you know nothing of, that you care nothing of, and you have no ideas for. So I think there is just a complex mix of name recognition, what the incumbent's done or hasn't done for that area, and then of course the wider political environment, which is, as much as we'd like it not to matter, we'd like it to almost be, dare I say, a transactional relationship between what have you put in and what have you got out in terms of your role as mayor. That's not actually how it works. It's obviously, you know, related to the political environment too. So I think name recognition matters a great deal in politics, but it's obviously part of the wider point too.
Thank you, Keiran. Did either of you, Heather or Laura, did you want to come in on that, or should we move on to another question?
I would just say, one of the things about the West Midlands is there really is a huge sort of entrepreneurial spirit here, and I do think you see that play out in our candidates. You know, they are passionate people whose backgrounds are not politics, but that's how it's been for the third election. Results here in the West Midlands, and actually, I think I hope that's inspiring to people who want to play a role in politics. That it doesn't. You can bring a whole breadth and depth of other experience to a role and still be successful. And so I mean, I do in this bit where like we need to get people excited again about why democracy matters, why local democracy matters. It's really important, I think, for people to see different types of people get involved. For me, I found that quite inspiring.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think it was interesting, wasn't it, that when this was set up, and I'm old enough to remember when the London mayor was originally set up, it was the whole idea was that we would have different people coming and getting involved. And the classic example was given was Richard Branson or some great big entrepreneur that was very popular. Be interesting, I think, to see which politicians from the national stage will be at the next round of elections. So whether or not some of the Conservatives who have decided to leave, or who the electorate will decide during the general election that they're going to leave, whether any of them will start looking at the mayoralties in the next round.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating thing to find out. I think we'll all be looking out to see if any of that plays out. Thank you, Heather. Very quickly, before I give our panelists the next question, which I think there's a couple from the chat on devolution to look at, I'm just putting into the chat function here on Zoom a link for our next webinar. That's going to be held next week. We're very excited to be hosting Eric Pickles and Hilary Armstrong to talk about how hard it is to decentralize effectively, something that those two politicians may have very different perspectives on. And of course, there's all sorts of interesting things to chat about more broadly. So do please sign up for that one. Just a quick advert, little plug in the middle here. So back to the Q&A with our current brilliant panel. There's a number of questions coming in broadly on the topic of devolution. We've got Paul Ogden pointing out that we operate within an incredibly centralized state. Should postcode lottery become more about postcode choice? We've got another questioner coming in anonymously to say that, we're talking about the financial pressures on local and to some extent combined authorities as well. Devolution around public services, we should ask what that looks like, bearing in mind that this is where those financial pressures tend to arise from. Heather, the scope, the prospects for further devolution at this point.
So I would say, why are we? It's fascinating what central government and Westminster politicians want to fiddle with, isn't it? There are plenty things that a national government should be getting itself interested in, and yet we currently have a Secretary of State who wants to dictate the work practices of South Cambridgeshire Council. So do you know what? If he wants to, it's entirely up to him. But why not go off and do something more creative? I completely agree with Laura. I think everything should be devolved down where it possibly can. I think we should have much more fiscal devolution and freedom. And, you want to reinvent democracy and increase turnout, give people the powers over the finances and see what will happen then. But I would say, I would agree with Laura in that, and this is where I get slightly, people get slightly cross with me in local government, that there does need to be accountability. If you are going to hand over powers from the centre, you can argue as much as you like that we have too much centrism and that those powers shouldn't be held in the centre. But if we're going to convince central government to hand powers back down to local government, then they probably want to check that it's going to go okay. And I'm fine with that. Let's have a system whereby people can see how well their council is performing, and then there is no excuse for not handing everything over to local government.
Fascinating. Unless I suppose those accountability metrics show that local systems can't manage. And I suppose that is one of the risks of that approach from a local government centralist perspective.
So back in the day when we had the Audit Commission, which is incredibly unpopular now, but there was the argument that if your council was excellent, you should have freedoms and flexibilities that went alongside that. Now, I'm not saying it should all be about a beauty pageant, but there should be an ability to say, well, actually, do you know what, these councils here are better run than central government, so why are we insisting that they shouldn't have their own freedoms and flexibilities?
It's an interesting point. Keiran, this strikes me as an area of debate that is too wonkish to penetrate much with the average voter. Is there explicit appetite for decentralization? Do people recognize that this is a over-centralized country?
Yes, I think there's general, you in various polls we've done in different shades and shapes and sizes about this topic, you'll get majorities say that they like the idea of decisions being made locally, but in many ways that is a sort of, I don't know, an inherent response to a much more complicated question, because often what you'll find is that people like the idea of devolution. I'll use a slightly off on a tangent example. The railways, obviously there was a sense that they were bureaucratic and too centralized, and then it'd be better to devolve everything to various regions because that people there would be more empowered to make the right decisions for those regions. But then once you do that, then people say, well, it's not joined up enough, actually there's too much inefficiencies and there has to be some sort of central control. So I think from a public opinion perspective, they just want to see things work, and they just want to feel like their area has a voice. And I think that second point is important. As I alluded to in my opening remarks, it does vary around the country, almost not quite this straightforward, but almost the further north you get, the more of a sense that the London and the southeast doesn't listen to us and doesn't listen to our needs. But ultimately there is that central government authority too, and that's not me trying to be unpopular on the webinar, but I think for the public it's about delivery. Yes, the principle of local is great. I want to say what happens in my local area. But as I've explained to you earlier, most people don't actually know a great deal about how decisions are made locally. They just want to feel that they're represented.
Yeah, and don't worry, Keiran, there's absolutely no risk of your unpopularity on the webinar. I think there's a minimal issue on that. Laura, your view on this. We also have a question relevant here from the Q&A, which I might put out there before you answer, Laura, which is from Tony Smith, who I believe is joining us from Birmingham, talking about, accountability has to go hand in hand with devolution. But why would we expect engagement and interest unless we engage in fiscal devolution? We need local politicians to be holding the levers when it comes to deciding level of taxation and what those taxation, what that resource is then spent on. So what fiscal devolution steps would people on the panel make to change this? Laura, I don't know if you think about fiscal devolution very often.
I think dream about it. Simon, I don't know how often we think about it. We're so far from having it. It feels quite far out. Again, it's just so many different things have been tested, from sort of hotel tax to do you take the first few pence off a central pot and bring it to the region. And I think what I would say is we've made some amazing strides through the Trailblazer devolution deal, and we have made in some areas some real progress. But I would just say I don't think there's an appetite really centrally to move a meaningful conversation on fiscal devolution. Not that I can see anyway.
Interesting. Are you getting any different reading from the tea leaves, Heather, when it comes to the specific question of fiscal devolution?
I think fiscal as a whole is just a bit of a dead subject, isn't it, really? I think there's a recognition that public services at the moment are incredibly difficult in terms of funding. And that goes, it's not just local government, that goes across all public services. I think I think for me, most of the debate within local government, there does seem to be a bit of an excitement about potentially having fiscal devolution in various different forms amongst some of the think tanks and some of the other Whitehall wonks. But I think in terms of the reality for it, I can't see that being the first priority of an incoming government of any political colour, whilst they have very little money to spare. So I think the main thing for me, that the thing that I'm seeing at the moment, people surrounding themselves by, is looking really towards economic growth, about how they can increase the income of their local area through economic growth, rather than hanging on and hoping that at some point somebody will give them a bit of flexibility on council tax or other baskets of taxes. But if you're interested in it, there's always the Lions Review, which I think it's 2007, but I don't think we've implemented even a fraction of them. So there's plenty of options and ideas in there.
Yeah, some of the thinking's been done. It's a question of whether it gets picked up, isn't it? Always in these sorts of questions. We're getting ever so close to time. What I want to do to finish today's fascinating conversation, which I've enjoyed so much, and I hope everyone joining us live has enjoyed too, is to give each of our panelists a chance to tell us if they were the GP or the medical specialist and were looking at local government system of England and to come in with some complaints, what would their rating on its health be, and how would you describe your diagnosis of the state of play? It's gonna be arbitrary and unfair whoever I go to first, but Keiran, the health of the body local polity.
I thought it might be me first because I was third in the opening remarks. What am I grading it on? A to F or something?
Yeah, so it's out of A to F.
Look, look, I will give a grade because it's boring when people caveat their way out of these answers. But I think it's obviously it's different in different areas of the country, right? And we've seen that with the 114 notices and so on. You'd probably give it a D or something. I think maybe that's being generous. Why? There's intense public dissatisfaction about services and a real sense that things aren't working, and the local conversation is part of that. And I do think this passivity, this lack of engagement or lack of this knowledge gap that I mentioned earlier is really, really an important factor in that. And it's not obvious, a bit like if you fall asleep on your arm and you want to let the blood flow come back in, it's not obvious that blood flow of cash, if I can use that metaphor, like butchering my metaphors today, it's not obvious that that's coming or waiting in the wings. So, for me, if you're trying to diagnose solutions, ultimately it's going to come down to cash one way or another. But assuming there isn't a magic pot at the end of the rainbow, another metaphor again, I think it's just about reforming how things are done. How do you deliver more with less? How do you join things up? How do you create efficiencies when you're fighting complex multi-departmental issues like homelessness or something? That's not an easy question. So it's all eyes are going to be on the manifestos, I think, as we come towards an election to see what is proposed.
Brilliant, thank you. So a D from Keiran, who thank you for being so game and jumping in and giving us a letter score. Over to you, Laura.
Well, the only thing more boring is that everybody giving it the same score. So I'm going to give it a C. I absolutely recognize all of what Keiran has set out. I absolutely do. And let's be honest, the financial trouble that is facing councils is severe. The pressure on their services is unprecedented, and the challenges that they are facing is severe. I'm a little bit more buoyed by the fact that I do think there is a real appetite for devolution. It's never going to be at the pace and breadth that somebody who does my job wants. That I should always keep that level of ambition, right? But we have made some really great strides, and I think thinking in that sort of systems thinking around things like homelessness, but also the approach that we're going to be taking where our local authorities are developing place-based strategies from which we think about how we apply our single settlement. I'm really hopeful that if we get that right, that we will be able to do some of that work that Keiran was talking about how we make things, the sum bigger than the bit of its parts while we're on metaphors.
Yeah, brilliant. And time maybe just for one more metaphor, Heather. We're at time, but what's your take?
I've got the great metaphor for this. I think local government's currently in intensive care, and we need whoever forms the next government to come in with their paddles. I think sort of D- on finances and A+ for trying. And I think I would correct Keiran as well slightly, because it's not more for less anymore. It's less for less. It's trying to work out how not to do things anymore and how to hand them on to other people and work in partnership with other public sector bodies in the area and the public in order to try and get out of this in a way that reinvigorates local democracy.
Brilliant answers. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone watching online really enjoyed this. The video will be shared shortly, so please do share it with your friends when it's out. It just remains for me to thank properly Keiran, Laura, and Heather, and to say enjoy the rest of your days, and let's see what happens next. There's lots to come in this space. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Take care.